My name is Ross, and for 28 years I was the man whose signature meant a bridge wouldn't collapse. That's not a metaphor. I was the lead civil engineer and the official engineer of record for Apex Engineering's entire municipal division. It's a legal designation, a heavy one. It means my personal professional engineering license was the guarantee behind every city contract we bid on, every water main we laid, and every overpass we retrofitted. It meant if something failed, it was my name, my reputation, and my freedom on the line. The company needed my license to even be in the room. They thought they owned it. They found out they were just renting it. The day after they fired me to make way for a cheaper, younger team, they were on the phone, their voices tight with a panic they couldn't hide, asking me for my help. They didn't understand the catastrophe they had unleashed, but they were about to. If you've ever poured your entire professional life into a company only to be told you're just a number on a spreadsheet, then you know the quiet cold that settled over me in that moment. Stick around, because this is the story of what happens when they forget that the person they fired is the same person holding the only key to the building. And if you enjoy stories where competence gets the last laugh, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss how this plays out. The meeting was in conference room 3B. That was the first sign. 3B was the windowless box they used for bad news. It had beige walls, a faint smell of burnt coffee and desperation, and a long polished mahogany table that reflected your face back at you, making you an unwilling witness to your own professional execution. I'd been with Apex since it was just Henderson Engineering, a small, respectable firm run by a man, Mr. Henderson, who believed in slide rules and handshakes. When he sold to a national conglomerate 10 years ago, the name changed to Apex, and the soul began to leak out, replaced by things like synergy and optimization. Waiting for me in 3B were two people. The first was a woman from human resources I'd never seen before. She had the forced, placid smile of a funeral director. The second was Carlton Vance. Carlton was new. He was the chief operating officer, a title that meant he didn't build anything. He just decided who was too expensive to keep building. He was maybe 35, with a sharp suit, a sharper haircut, and an MBA from a school that taught him everything about the cost of things and nothing about their value. He had a look on his face that he probably thought was somber and respectful. It wasn't. It was the look of a man trying to swat a fly without getting his hands dirty. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured to a chair. I didn't take it. I preferred to stand. It's a small thing, but in a room like that, you take what little high ground you can get. He started with a torrent of corporate nonsense. He talked about right-sizing the organization and pivoting towards a more dynamic, cost-effective project management model. It was a word salad designed to obscure a simple, brutal truth. He was firing me after 28 years of service, of late nights and weekends, of driving out to a broken water main in the middle of a January ice storm. My career at Apex was ending in a 5-minute meeting in a beige box. He finally got to the point, or what he thought was the point. Ross, he said, his voice smooth as Teflon, your position as lead engineer is being made redundant. Redundant, like an old piece of machinery, not a person. We appreciate your many years of service, he continued, sliding a thick folder across the table. The severance package. The company is moving in a new direction and will be transitioning your responsibilities to a more streamlined team structure. I knew what that meant. It meant Bryce, a kid fresh out of university with a master's degree and a C-plus average in his practicals, a kid I wouldn't trust to design a doghouse, was my replacement, or part of my replacement. They'd probably need 3 of him to do half of my job, but on paper their combined salaries would look like a win to the accountants. I just stood there, my hands clasped behind my back. I didn't say anything. The silence seemed to unnerve him more than any shouting match would have. He expected me to argue, to plead, to get angry. I did none of those things. I just looked at him, and then I looked at the HR woman, who was now studying the grain of the mahogany table as if it held the secrets of the universe. Inside, a cold, quiet calm was spreading through me. It wasn't shock, it was clarity. Carlton cleared his throat. Of course, we'll need you to help with the transition. We've arranged for your replacement, Bryce, to shadow you for the next 2 weeks to ensure a smooth handover of all project files and, of course, the transfer of your title. And there it was, the fatal mistake. The colossal, arrogant, career-ending blunder, the transfer of your title. He said it so casually, as if engineer of record was a hat I could just pass to the next guy in line. He didn't understand. It wasn't a title. It was a legal and ethical mantle, inextricably bound to my personal license, PE license number 7135, issued by the State Engineering Board. It was a license I had earned, that I maintained with continuing education on my own dime, and for which I held sole personal liability. It wasn't a corporate asset. It was me. I finally spoke. My voice was even, quiet. I see. The HR woman looked up, relieved I had finally made a sound. Carlton gave me a tight, satisfied smile, thinking he'd navigated the awkward part. He thought he had won. He thought he was being clever, saving the company a six-figure salary. He had no idea he'd just signed the death warrant for his entire division. I reached out and took the folder. I didn't open it, I just held it. "All right then," I said. "If that's all, I'll go clear out my desk." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him in his little beige box, basking in the glow of his own catastrophic ignorance. Competence isn't cheap, I thought, but they were about to learn just how expensive it is to lose it. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and gray asphalt. The city I had helped build, the sewer systems I had designed, the roads I had specified the grade for, all of it passed by my window like a silent movie. 28 years. I started with Mr. Henderson when the office was just 4 rooms above a bakery. I was young, hungry, and I believed that if you did good work, honest work, you would be rewarded. For a long time I was right. Mr. Henderson was a tough boss, but he was fair. He taught me that an engineer's first duty isn't to the client's budget, but to public safety. "The ground doesn't care about your profit margin, Ross," he used to say, tapping a blueprint with his worn fountain pen. "It only cares about physics, and physics never lies." He retired a decade ago, a happy man who sold his life's work for a fortune, entrusting it to a faceless corporation that promised to honor his legacy. They lied. When I got home, the house was empty. My wife, Sarah, was at work. The silence was absolute. I walked through the living room, past the photos on the mantel, the kids' graduations, our wedding, a picture of me and Mr. Henderson grinning, covered in mud at the groundbreaking for the Northwood Bridge. I didn't stop until I got to the back door and stepped into my workshop. This was my sanctuary. The smell of sawdust and varnish, the neat rows of tools on the pegboard walls, the half-finished oak cabinet I was building for our anniversary. Here, the rules were simple. Measure twice, cut once. A straight line was always a straight line. The laws of geometry were immutable. It was the opposite of the corporate world I had just been ejected from, where truths were flexible and loyalty was a liability on a balance sheet. I sank onto a stool, the cardboard box with my personal effects, a coffee mug with a faded Apex logo, a framed photo of Sarah, a well-worn copy of the civil engineering reference manual sitting on the floor beside me. And that's when the weight of it finally hit me. It wasn't just a job, it was an identity. It was the pride I felt driving my kids over a bridge and saying I helped build that. It was the quiet satisfaction of solving a complex drainage problem that saved a neighborhood from flooding. It was the trust placed in me by the city, by the public, a trust symbolized by that little plastic card in my wallet, my professional engineer license. Carlton Vance and his MBA hadn't just fired an employee. They had dismissed a lifetime of dedication as an inconvenient expense. The anger came then, but it wasn't hot and explosive. It was a cold, hard knot in my gut. I thought about all the times I had stayed late to double-check calculations, catching errors made by junior engineers that would have cost the company millions in rework. I thought about the weekends I gave up to meet impossible deadlines set by salespeople who promised the moon to clients. I thought about the time Carlton himself had come to me in a panic because a major project was about to miss a deadline which would have incurred massive financial penalties. He had begged for my help. "Ross, you're the only one who can fix this," he'd said, his usual arrogance replaced by a film of sweat. I had pulled 2 all-nighters, redesigned the workflow on the fly, and saved his skin. He had thanked me with a $500 gift card and a patronizing pat on the back. A few months later, he was the one telling me I was redundant. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. My mind started to catalog the projects. The Westwood Aqueduct retrofit, our biggest and most complex current project. A $50 million job to seismically upgrade a 100-year-old water conduit that supplied half the city. The plans were a labyrinth of modern engineering and century-old infrastructure. I was the only person at Apex who understood its intricacies, who had spent months in the city archives studying the original 1920s blueprints. My stamp, my number was on every single page of the active construction documents. Without me, those documents were legally meaningless. I remembered mentoring David Chen, a brilliant young engineer I'd hired right out of school 5 years ago. He was sharp, eager, and had a good heart. I taught him what Mr. Henderson taught me, that the computer can do the math, but the engineer has to bear the responsibility. Never sign off on something you don't understand in your bones, David, I'd told him. Your signature is a promise. Don't ever let anyone pressure you into breaking it. I wondered what was going through his mind right now. He would know, better than anyone, the hole my absence would leave. He would know that Bryce, the golden boy replacement, couldn't tell the difference between a load-bearing wall and a curtain wall. The phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from David. Heard what happened. I'm so sorry, Ross, it's not right. Another buzz. They've already put Bryce in your office. That one stung. They hadn't even waited for my chair to get cold. The disrespect was a physical thing, a sour taste in my mouth. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over me. What was I going to do? I was 58 years old. In the engineering world, that could feel like a dinosaur. Companies wanted young blood they could mold and underpay. They didn't want experience, they wanted compliance. Then Sarah came home. She walked into the workshop and saw me sitting there, the box on the floor, the look on my face. She didn't have to ask. She just came over, put her arms around my shoulders, and rested her chin on my head. We stayed like that for a long time. She didn't offer platitudes or tell me it would be okay. She just stood with me, a silent, solid presence. She had been my partner through all of it, the long hours, the stressful deadlines, the weight of the responsibility I carried. Finally, she pulled up a stool and sat opposite me. Her eyes were flinty. She was angry for me. Okay, she said, her voice calm but firm. So the bastards fired you. What happens now? I shrugged. I don't know. Look for another job, I guess. No, she said, shaking her head. That's not what I mean. I mean with the company, with the projects. You were the engineer of record. What does the law say you have to do when you leave a company like that? And just like that, the clouds parted. The despair, the anger, the sense of being a victim, it all burned away, replaced by a single sharp point of focus. She was right. This wasn't about my feelings. It wasn't about revenge. It was about my professional and legal obligations. My duty wasn't to Apex Engineering anymore. It was to the State of Arizona Board of Technical Registration, the body that granted me my license. It was to the public. The gears in my mind, the old reliable engineering gears that processed logic and consequence, started to turn. I stood up and walked over to my bookshelf past the woodworking manuals to a row of thick, serious-looking binders. I pulled one down. The State Professional Engineers Act. I opened it to the section on professional conduct. My finger traced the lines of dense legal text I had read a dozen times over the years. And there it was, clear as day. A licensed professional engineer, upon the termination of their employment with a firm for which they serve as the engineer of record, is required to provide formal written notification of their disassociation to the state board within 5 business days. It was not a suggestion. It was a requirement. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of an engineer who has just found the single critical stress point in a flawed design. Carlton Vance, in his arrogant rush to optimize, had overlooked the most fundamental rule of our business. He thought my license was a company asset he could just transfer like an office chair or a stapler. He didn't realize it was a personal legal covenant between me and the state. And by firing me, he hadn't just gotten rid of a salary. He had legally severed his company's ability to perform any of the work I was responsible for. Sarah, I said, looking up from the book, I know exactly what happens now. The fog of betrayal had lifted. My resolve was forged, not in anger, but in the cold, hard steel of professional duty. I wasn't going to set a fire. I wasn't going to sabotage them. I was simply going to follow the rules, and the rules were about to bring their whole house of cards crashing down. The next morning, I didn't wake up feeling like a victim. I woke up feeling like an engineer with a problem to solve. The problem wasn't my unemployment, it was the potential for catastrophic failure, legal, financial, and possibly even structural, at a company that had my name stamped all over its most critical projects. My plan, if you could call it that, wasn't born of malice. It was born of meticulous professional obligation. Malice is messy. Obligation is precise. My first step wasn't to call a headhunter, it was to call my lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a man named Arthur Finch, a specialist in professional liability and engineering law. Arthur was in his late 60s, with a mind like a steel trap and a demeanor so dry he made the Arizona desert look like a rainforest. He didn't do courtroom theatrics, he did airtight contracts and ironclad legal strategies. I had used him a few times over the years to vet complex municipal contracts for Apex. Carlton always complained he was too expensive. I was about to demonstrate his true value. I laid out the situation for Arthur over the phone, the termination, Carlton's assumption about transferring the engineer of record status, the Westwood Aqueduct project, everything. I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. "Oh my," he said, the glee in his voice barely contained. The arrogance of the modern MBA never ceases to astonish. They see a license on the wall and think it's a decorative plaque. They don't understand it's a pillar holding the roof up. He confirmed my reading of the state regulations. "You are not only entitled to notify the board, Ross, you are required to. Failure to do so could put your own license in jeopardy if something goes wrong and they're still operating under your name. This isn't just your right, it's your duty." That was the validation I needed. This wasn't revenge, it was self-preservation and ethical conduct. It just so happened that my ethical conduct was about to become Carlton Vance's biggest nightmare. We spent the next hour mapping out the process. It was a simple, two-pronged strategy. First, the notification letter. Arthur would draft it. It would be simple, factual, and devastatingly effective. It would state my name, my license number, my former employer, and my date of termination. No emotion, no accusation, just a formal statement of disassociation. This letter, once received and processed by the state board, would trigger an automatic cascade. The board's database would be updated, showing Apex Engineering no longer had a registered engineer of record for its civil projects. That, in turn, would flag their status with every municipal and state agency they held contracts with. It was like pulling the master pin on a complex machine. The second prong was a cease and desist letter, which Arthur would prepare and hold in reserve. This one would be addressed directly to Carlton and Apex's parent company. It would formally demand they immediately cease and desist from using my name, my license number, or any of my stamped and sealed project documents for any ongoing or future work. Using my sealed plans without my oversight wasn't just unethical, it was fraud. "We won't send this one yet," Arthur advised. "Let them walk a little further into the trap. Let them try to bluff their way through it first. It will make our position that much stronger when the time comes." After the call with Arthur, I turned to the second part of my secret plan, which was simply my life's work. In my workshop, I had several fireproof file cabinets. For years, I had made it a habit to keep personal copies of my final calculations and key design documents for major projects. It wasn't because I was planning for this day, it was because I was paranoid about fires, server crashes, and the general fallibility of corporate IT. Mr. Henderson had taught me to always have a backup. The company's server is their property, Ross. Your knowledge is yours. Don't ever confuse the two. Now, these meticulously organized files were my arsenal. They contained the institutional memory that Apex had just thrown out the door. The history of every decision, every material specification, every geological survey for the Westwood Aqueduct was in these drawers. It was the why behind the what, something young Bryce and his textbook knowledge would never be able to decipher from the company's soulless digital archives. My final piece of leverage wasn't on paper, it was a relationship. For 15 years, I had worked closely with Frank Peterson, the Director of Public Works for the City of Northwood, our largest and most important client. Frank was a no-nonsense ex-Marine who had seen it all. He didn't care about fancy presentations or corporate buzzwords. He cared about whether the water would run and the bridges would stand. Our relationship was built on a foundation of trust and brutal honesty. If a project had a problem, I told him first. If a budget was unrealistic, I told him why. He trusted my judgment, not the Apex logo on my polo shirt. I knew that when the notification from the state board hit his desk, his first call wouldn't be to Carlton Vance. It would be to me. That afternoon, I called David Chen. I felt I owed it to him. He answered on the first ring. "Ross, are you okay?" "I'm fine, David. Better than fine. Listen, I'm not asking you to do anything, and I don't want you to put your own job at risk. I just wanted you to know what's happening." I explained my legal obligation to notify the state board. I told him it was a matter of professional conduct. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then David let out a low whistle. "Oh man, they have no idea, do they? Carlton and Bryce were in your office this morning looking at the Westwood plans. Bryce was complaining that your documentation was overly complex. He said he was going to simplify the workflow." I had to laugh at that. Simplify it? David, the seismic calculations for the south abutment alone took me 3 months. They're based on geological survey data that's not even in the main file. It's in the supplementary archive I created. He's not simplifying it, he's gutting it. "I know," David said, his voice grim. I tried to tell him, and he just gave me this look and said, "I think my master's degree covered basic structural dynamics. Ross, this is going to be a disaster." "I know it is," I said. "Just keep your head down and do good work. And David, don't you dare sign or stamp anything you're not 100% sure of. Not for Bryce, not for Carlton, not for anyone. Your promise, remember?" "I remember, Ross," loud and clear. The next day, Arthur emailed me the draft of the notification letter. It was a thing of beauty in its bureaucratic lethality. I printed it, signed it with a steady hand, and drove to the post office. I didn't just drop it in the mail slot. I sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. There was a satisfying finality to watching the postal clerk stamp the green and white form. The die was cast. The signal was sent. It was no longer my problem. It was theirs. I had followed the law to the letter. Now all I had to do was wait for the laws of consequence to take their course. And I knew with the certainty of a well-poured foundation that the first cracks in Carlton Vance's perfect optimized world were about to appear. For 2 days there was only silence. It was an unnerving quiet, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. I spent the time in my workshop sanding the oak panels for Sarah's cabinet. The rhythmic scrape of the sandpaper on wood was therapeutic, a physical task with a clear, tangible result. It was a world away from the mess I had left behind. I didn't check my email. I didn't answer calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I had sent my message, clean and legally precise, into the bureaucratic ether. Now it was time for the system to do its work. The first tremor came on a Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't a call from Apex, it was a text from David. A single sentence that made my heart beat a little faster. "Frank Peterson just called Carlton. It has begun." I had to smile. Just as I predicted, Frank Peterson, the city's public works director, was not a man who suffered fools or tolerated ambiguity. The notification from the state board would have landed on his desk like a small official grenade. His department managed billions in public infrastructure. The legal standing of his contractors was not a trivial matter. I resisted the urge to call David back immediately. I had to maintain distance. I was a private citizen now, uninvolved. My role was to be a passive observer of the chaos I had legally initiated. I went back to my sanding, but my mind was in that office, imagining the scene. Carlton, smooth and confident, getting a call from his biggest client. I could picture his face shifting from smug assurance to a tight, controlled panic as Frank's gravelly voice on the other end of the line asked a question he wasn't prepared for. What the hell is this notice of disassociation for Ross Daniels, and why is his license no longer affiliated with your firm? An hour later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from David. I answered. His voice was low, hurried. He was clearly hiding in a stairwell or an empty office. "You're not going to believe this," he whispered. "Carlton tried to lie to him. He told Frank it was a clerical error, a typo in a database that would be corrected by the end of the day." "And Frank bought that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Of course not," David said, a hint of incredulous laughter in his voice. "Frank's been doing this for 30 years, he said, and I quote, 'Son, don't you dare insult my intelligence. The state board doesn't make clerical errors like this. You have until noon tomorrow to provide me with a legally satisfactory explanation, or I'm issuing a stop work order on every active city project you have. That includes Westwood.'" Then he hung up. The beautiful, terrible simplicity of it. Carlton's world of spreadsheets and buzzwords had just collided with the hard, unyielding reality of contractual obligations. The panic, David told me, was palpable. Carlton had stormed out of his office, his face the color of spoiled milk. He immediately called a crisis meeting with the legal team from the parent corporation. The word sabotage was being thrown around. They were trying to figure out how to spin this, how to contain it, but it was too late. The truth was already out, spreading through the city's bureaucracy like a dye marker in a water system. The next day, David updated me again. The stop work order had been officially issued. All Apex crews were pulled from the Westwood Aqueduct site. The project was frozen solid. The financial bleeding had begun. The daily penalties for missing milestones on a project that size were astronomical. Meanwhile, Bryce, my supposed replacement, was in way over his head. He had been tasked with finding a workaround. He was frantically trying to get another senior engineer from a different division, a guy who specialized in commercial HVAC systems, to review and co-sign my plans. It was a complete disaster, David said. The HVAC guy, Mark, took one look at the seismic calculations for the aqueduct and basically laughed in Bryce's face. He said, "I'm not putting my license on this. I wouldn't know where to begin. This is Ross's baby. Only he knows this stuff inside and out." Bryce tried to pull rank, saying Carlton had authorized it. Mark just packed his briefcase and said, "Let Carlton put his MBA on the line then," and walked out. The arrogance was being met with the quiet, stubborn integrity of other engineers who understood the weight of that signature. It was a line they wouldn't cross. They saw the trap Carlton and Bryce were walking into, and they wanted no part of it. The company was discovering a hard truth. Competence and the liability that comes with it are not interchangeable commodities. They thought they had fired one man. They were discovering they had fired their entire foundation. The panic at Apex was escalating from a frantic scramble to a full-blown meltdown. Bids they had submitted for 2 new municipal contracts the previous week were summarily rejected. The reason cited was simple and brutal: failure to meet the minimum requirement of a registered engineer of record for civil projects. The revenue stream that my division had generated, the lifeblood of their local operation, had been severed at the source. And then on Friday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID said Apex Engineering. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a message notification popped up. It was from Carlton Vance. His voice was no longer smooth or controlled. It was strained, brittle. "Ross, it's Carlton. We need to talk. There seems to have been a misunderstanding regarding your departure. Please call me back as soon as you get this. It's urgent." A misunderstanding. That's what he was calling it. He still couldn't bring himself to admit he had made a mistake. He was still trying to frame it as a mutual problem, a little mix-up we could smooth over. He still didn't get it. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't need to hear it. I already knew what he wanted. He wanted me to fix the mess he had created. He wanted me to rent him my license, my liability, my good name, to paper over his incompetence until he could find another solution. I looked around my workshop. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air. The oak cabinet was starting to look like a real piece of furniture. It was solid, well-built, and honest. Everything Apex Engineering was not. I hadn't taken anything over. I hadn't sabotaged a single file. I had simply stepped away and allowed the structure they had weakened to collapse under its own weight. The silent takeover was complete. The power had shifted, and they were only just beginning to understand the price of their cost-effective solution. The weekend passed in a state of surreal calm on my end, and according to David's intermittent texts, escalating panic on theirs. The corporate lawyers were now practically living at the Apex office, trying to find a loophole in the state regulations that didn't exist. The parent company was demanding answers, and Carlton had none to give. His streamlined team structure was proving to be a streamlined path to total operational failure. On Monday morning, the real power shift began, and it started with the people. David called me, not from a stairwell this time, but from his car. "I did it, Ross," he said, and I could hear the relief and trepidation in his voice. "I just handed in my resignation. I gave them 2 weeks' notice, but Carlton told me to just pack my things and leave immediately. I think he sees me as a spy." "You did the right thing, David," I said, a sense of pride welling up in me. "You're too good an engineer to be part of that circus." "That's not all," he said. "Before I left, Maria from Geotech and Sam from the survey team pulled me aside. They're putting in their notices this afternoon. They said they're not willing to work on projects where safety and standards are being thrown out the window. They asked me to let you know." This was the talent exodus. It wasn't something I had orchestrated or even encouraged. It was a spontaneous chain reaction. Good people don't want to work for a company that's ethically compromised and professionally adrift. Maria and Sam were two of the best technicians in the company, people I had worked with for over a decade. They were the ones who did the painstaking field work that my designs were based on. Without them, Apex didn't just lack an engineer of record, they lacked the skilled hands to even gather the data. The entire institutional knowledge base of the municipal division was walking out the door, one person at a time. They weren't just losing projects, they were hemorrhaging the competence needed to ever win them back. And then came the desperate counter-manipulation. My phone rang at 10 a.m. It was Carlton again. This time I answered. I put the phone on speaker and set it on my workbench. "Ross, thank God. I've been trying to reach you," he said, his voice a frantic mess of forced bonhomie. "I've been busy, Carlton," I said calmly, picking up a piece of fine grit sandpaper. "Listen, Ross, there's been a terrible misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. What happened last week, it was a mistake, a procedural error that should never have happened." I said nothing. The sound of the sandpaper on wood filled the silence. He plowed on, his desperation growing. "We want you to come back. We'll tear up the severance package. Full reinstatement, of course. In fact, we'd like to offer you a promotion, Vice President of Municipal Engineering. A 20% raise. You can name your terms. We just need to get these projects back on track." The offer was ludicrous. The very promotion I had been passed over for years now being dangled like a carrot because his own incompetence had backed him into a corner. He wasn't offering it out of respect for my ability, he was offering it to save his own skin. He thought he could buy my integrity. He thought my principles had a price tag. "Let me be clear, Carlton," I said, my voice as flat and hard as a granite countertop. "You're not offering me a job. You're trying to rent my license to fix a problem you created. The answer is no." There was a sputtering sound on the other end. "Ross, you're not being reasonable. We're talking about millions of dollars in projects. The company's reputation is on the line." "No, Carlton," I corrected him. "Your reputation is on the line. My reputation is just fine. It's protected by my adherence to my professional code of conduct. Something you might want to read up on." His tone shifted instantly from pleading to threatening. The cornered animal was baring its teeth. "You know our lawyers are looking at this very closely. They seem to think your actions constitute deliberate industrial sabotage. You have a duty of loyalty to this company." I cut him off. "My duty of loyalty ended when you told me my position was redundant. My duty to the State Engineering Board, however, is permanent. And as for your lawyers, they're welcome to speak with my lawyer. His name is Arthur Finch. I'm sure he'd be delighted to discuss the matter with them. He's also holding a rather interesting cease and desist letter regarding Apex's continued fraudulent use of my sealed engineering documents. I imagine that would make for a fascinating conversation. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I had just checkmated him, and he knew it. The threat of a lawsuit was a bluff, and I had called it with a full house. He was operating illegally, and I had the law, the ethics, and the facts on my side. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want, Ross?" It was the question I had been waiting for, the moment of total capitulation. He was no longer in control, I was. "Want," I said, setting the sandpaper down. "I don't want anything from you, Carlton. You had your chance to value what I brought to your company, and you threw it away for a line item on a spreadsheet. Goodbye." I hung up the phone. The power shift was complete. It wasn't just that they needed me, it was that they had absolutely nothing to offer me that I could possibly want. They had proven that their promises were worthless and their respect was non-existent. The only thing they had left was a mess of their own making, and I was no longer on their payroll to clean it up. The final act of my vindication didn't come with a dramatic boardroom showdown or a shouting match. It arrived, as most truly significant things do, with a quiet and professional phone call. A week after my conversation with Carlton, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I knew by heart, Frank Peterson's direct line at the city's Public Works Department. "Ross," he said, his voice its usual gravelly calm, "heard you've gone into the private sector." News traveled fast. "Something like that, Frank," I replied, still figuring out the next steps. "Well, let me help you figure it out," he said, getting straight to the point. "The Westwood Aqueduct is a critical piece of city infrastructure. It cannot and will not be delayed by corporate incompetence. I've officially terminated the city's contract with Apex Engineering for cause, effective this morning." I felt a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. It wasn't glee, it was the feeling of order being restored. "The thing is, Ross," he continued, "our trust was never in Apex, it was in you. It was your name on the plans we approved, your assurances we banked on. So I have a question for you, and I need a straight answer. If you were to form your own consulting firm, would you have the capacity to take over as the prime contractor and see the Westwood project through to completion?" This was it, the moment the entire narrative had been building towards. It wasn't about revenge, it was about value. The market, in the form of my most important client, was deciding what and who had real value. And it wasn't the MBA with the spreadsheet, it was the engineer with 28 years of experience. "Yes, Frank," I said, my voice steady, "I believe I would." "Good," he said. "Have your lawyer draw up a proposal and get it to my office by the end of the week. We'll fast-track the approval. Welcome back to the job, Ross." He hung up. I stood there in my workshop, the phone still in my hand, looking at the half-finished cabinet. My new company didn't even have a name yet, let alone an office or a business license. But it already had its first client and its first $50 million contract. Within 48 hours, I had filed the incorporation papers. Daniels Engineering and Associates, LLC. It had a nice solid ring to it. Arthur Finch handled the legal side with ruthless efficiency. My first official act as founder and CEO was to call David Chen. "David," I said, "how would you like to be the first vice president of a brand new engineering firm?" He accepted before I even finished the sentence. My next calls were to Maria and Sam, the geotech and survey specialists who had quit Apex. I offered them senior positions with better pay and a stake in the company's success. They were on board immediately. We started in my garage, we set up folding tables, ran extension cords, and fired up our laptops. It was chaos, but it was our chaos. It was vibrant, energetic, and built on a foundation of mutual respect. We were a team of seasoned professionals, stripped of the corporate bureaucracy, and united by a common purpose to do good work. The news of Carlton's fate trickled down to us through the industry grapevine. The parent company, faced with a massive lawsuit from the city for breach of contract and the complete collapse of their municipal division, had needed a scapegoat. Carlton Vance was unceremoniously fired. His dynamic, cost-effective model had cost them their biggest client and tens of millions in lost revenue and penalties. His name became a verb in local engineering circles. To pull a Carlton meant to make a catastrophically arrogant and ignorant business decision. I never had a final confrontation with him. I didn't need one. His failure was a far more eloquent statement than any words I could have offered. My vindication wasn't in seeing him fall, it was in the act of building something better in its place. 3 months later, I was standing on a windy bluff overlooking the Westwood construction site. The project was back on schedule. The sounds of machinery and workers filled the air. David was beside me, pointing out a section of newly installed seismic bracing. He was thriving, stepping into a leadership role with confidence and skill. Our small firm had already grown, and we had moved into a modest but professional office space downtown. We were profitable, respected, and most importantly, we were in control of our own destiny. I was being paid more than I had ever made at Apex, not just to do the work, but for the very responsibility they had so foolishly discarded. The vindication was complete. It was quiet, it was professional, and it was absolute. So what's the real lesson here? It's not just about getting even. It's about understanding your own worth, especially when the people signing your paychecks don't. For 28 years, I let a company define my value. They put a number on it, and I accepted it. They thought my title, my experience, and the legal responsibility I shouldered were just assets on their books, things they could own and trade. They forgot that the most valuable things a person brings to their work, integrity, trust, and deep hard-won competence, are not company property. They are personal, they are portable, and they are powerful. The whole situation taught me that competence has a price, but incompetence has a cost. Apex Engineering chose to stop paying the price, and they ended up paying a cost that dismantled an entire division and ruined careers. They looked at my salary and saw an expense to be cut. They failed to see the immense hidden value that salary represented, the safety of the public, the trust of their clients, and the legal foundation of their entire business model. They thought my signature was just ink on paper. They didn't understand that it was a promise, backed by a lifetime of work, and that promise belonged to me, not them. I spend more time in my workshop these days, but not out of stress. I do it for the joy of creation. The oak cabinet I was building now sits in our dining room. It's solid, functional, and beautiful. Every time I look at it, I'm reminded of the laws of physics and the rules of good work. A strong foundation, precise measurements, and an honest design. I built a new company on those same principles. My name is on the door, not as an employee, but as the founder. The quiet satisfaction of that reality is a better reward than any victory lap or dramatic confrontation. It's the peace that comes from knowing you've built something that will last. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or taken for granted in your own career, let me know your story in the comments below. I promise you I read them. It's important to know you're not alone, and if you want to hear more stories about what happens when the people in charge forget who really holds the power, do me a favor, like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Thanks for listening.